Peacock's new show, Devil in Disguise, John Wayne Gacy, goes beyond the infamous killer clown headline. But how much of that story is true? How much of it is embellished for TV? Well, to help separate fact from fiction, we're going to be speaking with Conti. She's the Chicago attorney who spent dozens of hours with John Wayne Gacy during his final death row appeals. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. Peacock's latest deep dive into true crime, Devil in Disguise, John Wayne Gacy, is here, and it is aiming to do something very different from other shows that have focused on killers or serial killers or true crime. What is it doing different? Well, according to the show summary on Peacock, this limited series doesn't just focus on the monstrous killer clown that we think we know, but instead, it, quote, peels back the twisted layers of Gacy's life while weaving in heart-trending stories of his victims, exploring the grief, guilt, and trauma of their families and friends, and exposing the systemic failures, missed opportunities, and societal prejudices that fueled his reign of terror. In fact, the show, starring Michael Chernus as Gacy, promises a sensitive approach. And it's so sensitive, in fact, that Chernus really only signed on to this show after showrunner Patrick McManus promised that no murders would be shown on screen. That is very different from what we've seen in other programs, right? So Chernus told Vanity Fair, absolutely in no way did I want to be part of something that was glorifying John Gacy. So the series is about the man, it's about the victims, it's about the investigation. But of course the question becomes, whenever we have a program like this, how much of this chilling story is true? What did the show get right? What did the show get wrong? Now, we're going to get into that a little bit later on because we're going to bring on Conti, who's a lawyer who represented Gacy during his final death row appeal. She spent dozens of hours with him, and we'll get insight into the real story of John Wayne Gacy. But first, let's just rewind to the beginning, what we know about this serial killer, okay? Picture Chicago in the 1970s, the quiet suburb of Norwood Park Township. John Wayne Gacy was the guy that everyone seemed to know. He was this successful building contractor, a Democratic precinct captain, the guy who even hosted neighborhood parties. And famously, he was this clown, Pogo the Clown, entertained kids at hospitals and parades. But behind that friendly facade was a profoundly broken man. According to multiple biographies that were written about Gacy over the years, Gacy's childhood was a nightmare. His father was a violent alcoholic who constantly belittled him. He was also allegedly sexually abused by a family friend. A psychiatrist for his defense later surmised that Gacy's crimes were just a twisted reenactment of his own childhood trauma, as if he was making his victims play the role of the helpless child while he became the punishing father. His violent tendencies, they started to surface early. In 1968, while living in Iowa, he was convicted of sodomy against a teenage boy and sentenced to 10 years. He served only 18 months, by the way. His first wife divorced him shortly after that. Biographers say he lost all contact with his two young children. He moved back to Chicago, bought this ranch-style house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue, started a new business, PDM Contractors, even remarried to a woman named Carol Hoff in 1972. But that year also ended up being the start of what would be a horrific crime spree. From 1972 to 1978, authorities say Gacy would lure young men and boys, often day workers, his own employees, people that he met at bus stations, to his home, promises of work, promises of money, and then he would use this handcuff trick to restrain them, saying it was part of a magic trick. In the end, he would assault them and strangle them. It's horrific. And according to the Chicago Tribune, his first known victim was 16-year-old Timothy Jack McCoy in 1972. His last is believed to have been 15-year-old Robert Peast in 1978. And it was Peast's disappearance, by the way, that finally brought this house of cards tumbling down. On December 11, 1978, Peast told his mother that he was going to speak to a contractor, John Gacy, about a job at the pharmacy where he worked, but he never came back. His mother, Elizabeth, filed a missing persons report that night, triggering an investigation that ultimately zeroed in on Gacy. Police put him under surveillance. They got a search warrant, and upon entering his house, they were hit with this overwhelming, sickly smell. They found a receipt for film that belonged to a friend of Peace, proving the boy had been inside. And that's when it started coming down. On December 21st, 1978, John Wayne Gacy was arrested for handing a package of marijuana to a gas station clerk while under surveillance. And with him in custody, police tore into his house. They found a trap door to a crawl space, and that is when they discovered the first of what would be 29 bodies buried on his property, 26 in the crawl space, 3 elsewhere on the lot. When questioned, Gacy confessed, almost proudly. He drew a map for police detailing where the bodies were buried. He talked about himself in the third person, blaming this alter ego named Jack for the killings. He was charged with a total of 33 murders. His trial, as you can imagine, was just a media circus. His lawyers argued he was insane. The jury didn't buy it, though. After just 2 hours of deliberation, they found him guilty of all 33 murders. And on March 13th, 1980, he was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row before being executed by lethal injection on May 10th, 1994. And to this day, 5 of his victims, they remain unidentified. So now that we've revisited the real history, now the question is, what about Peacock's version, right? What does Devil in Disguise, John Wayne Gacy, what does it get right? What does it maybe twist for storytelling purposes? So to help us sort through it, we have a special guest. We are going to be speaking right now with somebody who actually knew John Wayne Gacy. We're joined by Karen Conti. She's a Chicago attorney who met with Gacy dozens of times during his final appeals, wrote the book Killing Time with John Wayne Gacy, defending America's most evil serial killer on death row. Karen, thank you so much for coming here on Sidebar. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here, Jesse.
Now, I understand you watched the entire series, okay? You've spent, I believe, over 50 hours with John Wayne Gacy. So big picture, let's start here. What does this series get right about his character, his demeanor, his personality? Let's start there.
I think they get it absolutely right. And of all the series that I have seen over the years with the portrayals of Brian Dennehy and William Forsythe, this actor, Michael Chernish, gets it right. He has the demeanor, he has the looks, he has the accent, and most importantly, he has the vocabulary. And when I say that, I mean that Gacy was kind of a plain-speaking street guy, but he was full of braggadocio. He was a bullshitter, if I can say that. He was a person who was always in control, always manipulating. And even the words he used were words that he used in real life. And I have tapes of him, and I actually went back and listened, and I thought, gosh, they got his phrasing absolutely spot on. So if you want to know what Gacy was like one-on-one, this is the show to watch.
Now, obviously, this is a story that we wanted to bring to you, and the reason that we can do this, the reason we can cover things like this, is not only because of the amazing support that we get from all of you out there, but also from our incredible sponsor, Morgan & Morgan. This is America's largest injury law firm. This is a firm with over 1,000 attorneys. You know why they're so big? Because they win all the time. They have recovered over $25 billion for more than 500,000 clients. In the past few months, a client in Florida received $12 million after the insurance company offered just $350,000. Out in Pennsylvania, a client was awarded $26 million. That is 40 times the insurer's $650,000 offer. You have another client in Pennsylvania that received $29 million after being offered only $500,000. And even if you think your case isn't worth millions of dollars, why not just start a claim and fight for what you deserve? Morgan & Morgan makes it so simple. You can start a claim from your phone in just 8 clicks. So if you're injured, you can easily start a claim at forthepeople.com/LC sidebar by clicking the link below or scanning the QR code on screen. In other words, was he this charming, salesman-like figure that we see in the show?
Yeah, he was, but he alternated. You know, he could be very charming. He could be almost flirtatious. He could be engaging. He was also very smart, and he didn't miss a beat. So he could take in what everybody's weaknesses were in the room. He would ask you questions that were very pointed, and it wasn't because he was interested. It was because how was he going to use this against you or to get what he wanted, which is a typical antisocial behavior, a trait, as far as, and also a narcissist, which he was both. So he was brilliant at it, but he also had that aspect where he was a know-it-all, and you kind of didn't like him for that reason.
Did you get any sense of there's these dark spots, right? Did you get ever a sense of, oh, there's an opening to how evil he was, or if somebody met him, they would have absolutely no idea? I mean, were there these darker openings, these signs?
No, there really weren't, because everyone thinks that a person who does these evil things has fangs or is going to show his true colors. But I will tell you, I sat with him knowing what he did in great detail, unfortunately for me. And just looking at him, I could not reconcile the person I was talking to with what I know he did. So he hid it. He was a very compartmentalized person. And you did not, once in a while you saw maybe a comment where he would try to disparage the victims and say things like, well, what were they doing out late at night anyway? And they were a bunch of hustlers. But you saw that in the series where he really denigrated them, like as if to say they weren't worth living anyway. So that was really the only glimpse that I ever saw into how he really, put his brain around this whole thing.
In other words, and I don't mean to put words in your mouth, he never really showed any kind of remorse. I mean, he'd already been on a death row for quite some time when you met him. Never any sign of remorse?
None whatsoever. In fact, he thought of himself as a victim. He absolutely thought of himself as a victim. And you see in the series where, he's talking to his lawyer at the trial level, and he's basically saying, oh, I killed this guy in self-defense. Oh, this one wanted money from me. Oh, this one did this to me. And, 33 times, right? So just, it's surreal to see that again after all these years that he's been gone, do the same thing.
I want to get a little bit more into specifics here and see what might be true, there might have been some creative liberties. So the series opens with the disappearance of Robert Peast, right? This 15-year-old boy who's vanishing, by the way, finally unraveled Gacy's double life. All of that true? I mean, that would be the one that blew this whole case wide open, right?
Yes, I think that was pretty accurate. I don't see anything in that depiction that was not accurate. The poor mother, it's her birthday. She's going to pick up her son, her beautiful 15-year-old son, who's trying to get a job and working at a pharmacy. She's in the parking lot. He's not there. She has no idea why. Gacy took him, told him, hey, we're going to get you a job. And by the time she got home, he was probably already being tortured. So yes, that was very accurate. And Robert Peast is the reason that Gacy ultimately got caught. And it was the mother who pushed the issue to make sure the cops went over there to investigate it.
And this is something, Robert Peast's case, that you write about quite vividly in your book. What does Robert's story mean to you personally?
I have to tell you, just because I represented somebody who did these horrible things, doesn't mean that I don't have compassion for the victims. Of course I do. And I represent victims all the time in different matters. So for some reason, there was a connection with him. I represented Gacy, when I was just out of law school. But when he was committing his crimes, I was in high school. So he was the boogeyman growing up in Chicago. And I really, for some reason, connected with Peast because he was my age. He was the same year in high school. He was a kid that, you would like to have dated, and he just for some reason, he haunts me. Gacy doesn't haunt me. Gacy was never frightening to me, but I always felt like, what could I have done to save this kid? I know that sounds ridiculous, but could that have been prevented? Could that boy's life have been saved? And, it's just something that haunts me.
No, I understand. By the way, what was it like to represent him, and what were the legal arguments that you were making? We'll get a little bit more into the case, but what was it like to represent him, and what were your arguments?
Well, it was a losing case. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well, but at the very end, when he has a death date set, you are all out of all traditional appeals. All the appeals that you have over 14 years are gone. So now you're doing your Hail Marys. And, basically we said that, you couldn't use the lethal injection machine because it was a failed method of execution, which it did fail with Gacy. We used all kinds of arguments about the jury instructions, about him not getting a fair trial. All the things that we kind of rehashed but came up with new arguments. We knew it was going to be a tough one, but I will tell you, part of the reason that I represented Gacy was because I'm against the death penalty. And when you represent somebody on death row, you're kind of making an argument for the rest of the people on death row who might have really good defenses like actual innocence, etc. So you're kind of setting a precedent, hopefully, to help other people on death row, be exonerated. And in Illinois, we had 12 exonerations and 12 executions within a certain number of years period. So we weren't getting it right at all.
Was John Wayne Gacy nervous about being put to death?
Not at all. In fact, when I was the one who had to tell him that the U.S. Supreme Court had turned down his very last appeal, and he couldn't be bothered with it. He was making jokes to me, saying that one of the justices dissented. He said, "You make sure that you send him a thank you note from John Gacy." And he told me, your name is in your obituary. My name is going to be in your obituary. And he was bragging to the end. He was not nervous. I almost thought that he didn't really get what was going to happen to him. But I told him what was going to happen. I told him when it was going to happen. I told him how it was going to happen. And he did not seem nervous at all.
I want to just go back to something with Robert Peace for a second. So his mother, Elizabeth, is shown filing this $85 million lawsuit against the people that she felt had failed her son and others. That lawsuit actually happened?
It did. It was dismissed. And as you know, it's very difficult to sue authorities because the government has qualified immunity, meaning you have to prove something more than negligence. And her lawsuit basically blamed the Iowa prison system because, as the film shows, he was incarcerated in Iowa for sodomizing a young man and was released very early, got a 10-year sentence and was released in 18 months. And she said that that basically you should never have done that. And all of the psychiatric reports that he was going to be a menace to society. And guess what, right? So unfortunately for her, that lawsuit was dismissed.
I can understand why she filed it, though. I mean,
yes.
Victim family member, it's tough to reconcile this. And by the way, going back to the execution, so the series does something interesting. It shows that Gacy's victims' families, talking about them, were essentially misled about witnessing his execution because essentially they're placed in a room, led to believe they'd witness his execution, and then they realize that it already happened. Is that true?
That's the one piece that I think is absolutely false. And here's why. There were so many victims, right? There's 33 young men and boys, and the press wanted to be in on it. I wanted to be there. I wasn't allowed to be there as his defense lawyer. So they had to limit the number of people. So they had a lottery of all things, and you had to pick a number. And this was all done before the execution, well before the execution. And so the people that were in that room were largely media people with a few victims' family members. So the idea that they didn't know ahead of time that they weren't going to get to witness it is not true.
And why where did that even come from? I mean, where do you think they even, how did that even come to be?
Well, I think from an artistic standpoint, you see in this that the victims over the years, these boys were being killed. They were working for Gacy. They were last seen with Gacy. The police were ignoring the parents' calls. One parent called 100 times to say Gacy was last seen with my son. They didn't want anything to do with it. He was sodomizing young boys. He was being arrested. The charges were dropped. It was just a nightmare. So I think what the producers and the directors were trying to show is that the victims got the raw end of the deal here at the beginning, during the time that they should have been, had their young men, their cases investigated, but also at the end, that they didn't even get to see Gacy executed, which they desperately wanted to do for some closure or whatever closure. So I think they took a little license with that, but they were denied the opportunity, but I think they knew about it ahead of time.
Right. Well, talk about the victims. A very disturbing detail that's mentioned in the series is this so-called handcuff trick. So the show kind of explains it the way Gacy described it to investigators, convincing his victims to restrain their wrists before killing them. Is that accurate?
That is accurate. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It would be a joke. He'd say, "Hey, this is the handcuffed trick." He'd do it on himself, and he'd say, "Okay, look, I got out of it. Right now, you try it." And the poor kid would put the handcuffs on, and the trick was that he now had them under control. So, and that's how he had to do it because Gacy wasn't a big guy. And in fact, he was about 5'8", 5'9". He wasn't a particularly strong guy. And some of these young men were, they were young and they were, they could have fought him off had they not been handcuffed. So, yeah, that is true.
And as you try to make sense of this, these crimes and what he did, we hear this fictionalized Gacy, like referring to this darker version of himself, this other side, Jack Hanley. Is that something, a name that he ever mentioned to you, this alter ego, anything like that?
So by the time I represented him, he was very institutionalized and he had come up with his view on how he wanted to be viewed. So he never talked to me about that stuff. I read probably 14 inches of psychiatric reports, and some of the shrinks said, yes, I do believe that he had this dual personality, almost a schizophrenic type of thing, where he'd go into this Jack Hanley mode, who was a police officer, and he was there to kind of help the boys, but then the boys got in his car and then, then he was the good John, who was the family man and who was the hardworking business guy. I'm not sure I would buy into the idea that he had a split personality. I think he had a dark side. I think that some of the boys who escaped said something came over his eyes. He'd have this dark look, this vacant look when he went into his torture mode. And I believe you hear that from other people who are victims of killers and rapists. So a split personality, no, but definitely two different sides to who he was.
What do you think drove him to do it?
Yeah, isn't that the great question? And that was one of the things that I thought about hours and hours, and I still think about. And, I think it's both nature and nurture. He grew up in a very traditional 1940s, 50s home where the dad went to work and mom was kind of passive. And the father was an alcoholic and the father beat him. There's no question about that. But a lot of people come from that environment and don't kill 33 boys. So I think he knew at a young age that he was homosexual. I think that he was raised in a strict Catholic family. And back then, homosexuality was not, was not accepted. And he tried to deny who he was. And I think he confused sexuality with violence. And I think that maybe what he was doing is every time he killed a young man who he thought might be a homosexual, he was killing a part of himself. That's what I think.
It's an interesting perspective. No, it's interesting thinking about it like that. When people think of John Wayne Gacy, it's the clown angle. That's a big part of this. I want to dissect that a little bit because the series shows Gacy performing as this party clown, marching in parades, making balloon animals, visiting children's hospitals. And he's basically hiding this darker side. I mean, the show, he basically says putting on the clown makeup was as relaxing as drinking. How accurate was the portrayal of the clown angle in this program?
I thought it was very accurate. Gacy was very proud of his clowning. And just to be clear for your viewers, I mean, he never picked up a boy when he was in his clown getup. Okay, so obviously, I mean, people wouldn't probably go into a car with a guy dressed as a clown. He just did this on the side, and I think there were a couple things. I think it made him look like a good guy, and he liked to look like a good guy, a charitable person who donated his time. I also think it did mask that dark side of him, and I think it allowed him to get away with doing things that maybe wouldn't be acceptable. And there's a piece in this series where he talks about how he's in his clown suit and he gets to grab women and do all kinds of stuff because he's anonymous. And I think that Gacy enjoyed that part of it, that mask that allowed him and his darker side to be covered up while he did his bad, evil thoughts, I guess.
Yeah, he supposedly said clowns can get away with murder, right? And that's an interesting part because the show highlights how there was this police bias towards young men, particularly gay men, that allowed Gacy to continue killing for years. I mean, in your opinion, is that true? Was there a systemic bias, a prejudice playing into, Gacy evading capture for some time? Did the series get that part right?
I think it really got it right. I think that for the first time, it really is focusing on the law enforcement not believing the victims or not caring about the victims. And remember, it was a different time. Homosexuality got you fired from a job. In some places, it was still illegal. So the police really were dismissive of a lot of these boys. And Gacy did a great job of telling the police, oh, that kid was a runaway. Oh, he was a hustler. He was gay. Rough horseplay. That's just what these kids do. He was very good, and the police believed him because he was an upstanding person in the community who was politically connected and, was making good money. And he convinced them that these kids were not worth investigating. And I think it's really sad. And I think that we need to keep that in mind as we see people commit crimes, and not to further victimize the victims based upon their circumstances.
Yeah, and by the way, when Gacy was finally arrested in December 1978, detectives discovered, 26 bodies under his house? I mean, just steps from his neighbor's windows. And by the way, actor Michael Chernus told Chicago's WBEZ that the set was built to look, quote, like any other neighborhood near an airport. Tidy, ordinary, terrifying in hindsight. Karen, the show highlights how Gacy, and you mentioned this, was so woven into his community, volunteering, hosting parties, even meeting First Lady Rosalind Carter. All of that was authentic, right? Right? I mean, all of that was an accurate portrayal of what was going on.
Absolutely. And, the idea that he was standing next to Rosalind Carter when he had a conviction for sodomy, and the Secret Service didn't pick up on any of it. I mean, he slipped through so many cracks that, that would be a great book in and of itself, and how he got away with all the things that he did. And again, one other thing I should mention, at the time, when boys went missing, there wasn't a database, that connected. Hey, there's a boy missing here, there's a boy missing here. In fact, the Chicago police, even among their precincts, weren't connected when it came to paperwork. And that's what it was, paperwork, no computers at the time. So Des Plaines had a whole different, view of Gacy, because they weren't investigating anything that the Chicago police should have been investigating. So I think if this were to happen today, we'd have a different outcome, I hope, because of the connectedness of how we have our databases now.
And social media. In other words, it would be very difficult for him to be able to, the cell phone, surveillance. It'd be very hard for him to commit these crimes today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we know more about serial killers.
Yeah.
I think the idea that he was incarcerated, I got a 10-year sentence in Iowa, should have been a red flag. I mean, he would have been a sex offender. He would have had to register. Everyone in the neighborhood would have known who he was and what he did. So yeah, it was a different time. And you look at the changes, and those changes are obviously very good. And that's why you're seeing fewer serial killers.
I want to talk real quick about the lawyers. So the show depicts Gacy's defense attorney, Sam Amirante, as torn between this kind of professional duty and this moral disgust, but still being drawn essentially to the notoriety of this. You think that was accurate?
Absolutely accurate. I know Sam, and I will say this, everybody who's been associated with Gacy from a legal standpoint has done well in their careers, and I'll put myself in that bucket too. Bill Kunkel, the prosecutor, went on to become a great judge. He had a great legal career in a big law firm. Terry Sullivan wrote a book. He also had a great career. People are fascinated by your association, so they put you on a pedestal for no good reason other than you're associated with a horrific crime. Makes no sense, but you see that all the time with celebrity lawyers. Yes, Sam Amirante, when he sat through that confession, there was a scene there, a couple scenes, where Gacy was drinking heavily, and that's where he confessed to Sam. And Sam, to this day, is shaken to the core by listening to the details of the crimes, because Gacy had an excellent memory, and he was very visual, and he could recount exactly where he was, where he picked up the boys, what they looked like, sometimes their names, what their souvenirs were, what he did to them. And that was traumatic to Sam. But Sam was also a true believer that everyone is entitled to a defense. So I think it did capture it, Jesse. I think the show did a good job.
And how has it affected your life, your career, representing him at one point in time?
Well, at the time, it was terrible. I mean, clients quit me, and I got death threats. But afterward, it was more like I was a novelty. It's like, hey, she represented John Gacy. It's like, that's disgusting, but what was it like, right? Everyone's interested in what it was like. So I used that to my advantage. Of course I did. I went and I taught law school. I taught the death penalty, which was a great thing to do. I've done a lot of legal commentary. I have a radio show in Chicago because I got used to talking to the press. I wrote a book. And so, I think it has been really good for my career, strangely. I wouldn't suggest that to young lawyers, go out and represent a serial killer, but it made me resilient too. It made me immune from people saying bad things about me, disparaging me. Even to this day, after this is aired, I'm sure I'll get my hate mail from all over the world, and I've learned to just take it.
Well, no, look, you're an excellent attorney, and you've developed this expertise, unfortunately, about a certain class of people, and which is interesting because, and correct me if I'm wrong, you have drawn comparisons between John Wayne Gacy and Rex Heuermann, right? The Gilgo Beach serial killer, the Gilgo Beach suspect here. What are those parallels for people who don't know?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Gacy was a family man, just like Rex Heuermann. Gacy was in construction. Rex Heuermann was he was an architect. They both lived around a large city, New York, for the Gilgo Beach killer, Gacy, Chicago. And they both targeted people who weren't going to be missing. Not all of them, because, Rob Peast was a kid whose family was very connected. I think he just got sloppy there. But a lot of the people that Gacy found were runaways, people at a Greyhound bus station, maybe people who didn't have any money, so they were hustling sex. And we know the Gilgo Beach murder went undetected because all of his victims were sex workers. And, they were disappearing all in that same area, yet nobody was doing anything about it. The other thing that's a parallel is in the Gilgo Beach case, if you really get into it, there was some corruption going on in the local police department and the prosecutor's office. And I'm not saying there was corruption going on in Chicago, but Chicago was just messing this up. It wasn't doing what it was supposed to be doing, even given the time. So I think you have this very similar. Just he would stalk his victims. He chose them carefully. I think there's so many parallels here.
Yeah. Before we wrap things up, just big picture here, as you look back on this show, you said it seems mostly accurate, particularly its depiction of Gacy. You mentioned that the execution, certain aspects of it were some creative liberties. Was there anything else about it that you felt stretched, that was overly dramatized, that were things that, that wasn't exactly true? As we look back on it, were there certain aspects of this that you said, I think that this is just inaccurate, I want to clear the record?
I don't think there was anything exaggerated, and that's why I think it was a good piece, because you really didn't see the violence. They could have put the violence in there, but we don't need to see that. We know this was focused on the victims. I do think that the victims piece, where they had the kids before Gacy abducted them, have relationships and have jobs and have aspirations and made mistakes, and I think some of that probably was fictionalized, because how would they know? They probably don't know. But I think it added to the idea that these weren't just boys with their face, on a podium in a courtroom. These were kids who had things to do in their lives and parents who cared about them. And I think that even if that was fictionalized, it added to the importance of this series.
Well, Karen, listen, I really, really appreciate you taking the time to come on here and trying to separate fact from fiction and explain a little bit more of your experience with John Wayne Gacy. And if anybody's interested, again, I encourage them to take a look at your book, Killing Time with John Wayne Gacy. Karen Conti, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Jesse. Take care.
And that's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you should get your podcasts. You can follow me on X or Instagram. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.